Hello everyone, we're talking about the development of the eye. In this section, we'll deal with lens, the sclera, the choroid, and the ciliary body. So this section has been divided into the development of lens. We'll see how the lens develops in itself. Then we'll move on to the development of sclera and the choroid, and finally the development of the ciliary body. So first of all, the development of lens. So the development of a lens takes place from a lens vesicle, which is a derivative of the surface ectoderm. So here in the figure you can see this is the cavity of the lens vesicle, the anterior wall of the lens vesicle, the posterior wall of the lens vesicle. It is composed of columnar cells and their cuboidal cells on the lower aspect. So the lens develops from a lens vesicle, which is derived from the surface ectoderm. The lens vesicle is lined by a single layer of cuboidal cells. Here you can see a single layer of cuboidal cells is lining the lens vesicle. The cells of the anterior wall, they remain cuboidal. These cells, they remain cuboidal. However, the posterior wall cells, they become columnar. Here you can see that these cells have become columnar, extend into cavity of the lens vesicle. They are now extending into the cavity of the lens vesicle. Now they lose their nuclei to form transparent primary lens fibers. Here you can see now they have lost their nuclei and form the primary transparent lens fibers. Cavity of the lens vesicle is now obliterated. This cavity is then finally obliterated. Secondary lens fibers in equatorial zone of the lens are now formed. Now it forms the secondary lens vesicles, and the anterior layer persists as epithelium. So the anterior layer forms the epithelium, the cuboidal epithelium of the lens. So recapping the development of the lens, it develops from the lens vesicle. The lens vesicle is lined by cuboidal cells. The anterior cells remain cuboidal. However, the posterior cells, they first become columnar, then they lose their nuclei, they encroach on the cavity of the lens vesicle, and then they finally obliterate the cavity, forming the secondary lens fibers in the equatorial zone of the lens. And the anterior layer of the anterior cuboidal layer persists as epithelium of the lens. So what are developmental anomalies of the lens? These include the cataracts. Cataracts are actually any opacities in the lens. So any opacity in the lens is known as cataract. So we can have congenital cataract. It is present by birth. It is usually bilateral, that is, it involves both the eyes. It may be caused by rubella or toxoplasmosis, Down syndrome, or galactosemia. So these are some of the conditions that can cause congenital bilateral cataracts in the newborns. Now, an acquired cataract, it occurs due to aging. Now, the central part of the lens becomes harder. So this is the lens, and the central part of the lens, it becomes harder than the peripheral part. The old primary lens fibers have completed their lives and they degenerate. Now there's accumulation of a special set of proteins called crystalline within this lens, which causes the opacity of the lens. So it is something that happens with age that cannot be stopped. It usually happens in all the individuals, and the central part of the lens is what is affected mostly. Now, moving on to the development of the sclera and the choroid. So, the mesoderm, which around the optic cup, it forms the inner vascular layer, which forms the choroid, and outer fibrous layer that forms the sclera. So, we're talking about the mesoderm, which lies around the optic cup. So, this is the region of the optic cup. So this forms an inner layer and an outer layer. So the inner layer, this is the inner layer of the optic cup. The mesoderm around the inner vascular layer forms the choroid, and the outer fibrous layer forms the sclera. So moving on. The sclera has an anterior aspect which is continuous with the substantia propria of the cornea, and posterior aspect which is continuous with the dura mater surrounding the optic nerve. Now the choroid, it has an interior aspect which is continuous on each side with the ciliary body, and posteriorly it is continuous with the pyrechinoid around the optic nerve. These are the relations of the sclera and the choroid that have to be memorized as such. I know they're very dry, but the relations of the sclera and the choroid have to be memorized as such. So this is the layer of the choroid and this is the layer of the sclera. This is what we were talking about. This in pink, the light pink layer is known as the choroid, and this green layer is known as the sclera. The relations of both of which are important, have to be memorized as such. So moving on, we have ciliary body. Here you can see this is the ciliary body. It is actually a wedge-shaped extension from the core of the choroid anteriorly. So the ciliary body, when traced posteriorly, it becomes continuous with the choroid. So a wedge-shaped extension of the choroid anteriorly is known as the ciliary body. It is formed by the mesoderm around the anterior part of the optic cup. So it is formed by mesoderm which lies around the anterior part of the optic cup. It is continuous with the retinal pigment epithelium. It is also continuous with the retinal pigment epithelium. Now the pigment epithelium is derived from the outer cup of the outer layer of the optic cup. We know that already. However, the non-pigment epithelium layer of the ciliary body is derived from the inner layer of the optic cup. So this is what happens. The pigment epithelium is being derived from the outer layer of the optic cup, and the non-pigment layer being derived from the inner layer of the optic cup. So this is where the ciliary body lies. Here you can see this is the ciliary body. This is a complete cross section of the eye and gives perspective as to how the development process takes place and how the various layers are placed in relation with each other. It is important to understand the relation of cornea, retina, sclera with each other so that one can easily make out what is going on. So this is the pigmented layer of the retina. Here you can see this in purple is the pigmented layer of the retina. This in yellow is the neural layer of the retina. So here you can see the ciliary body is in contact with the pigmented layer of the retina and also with the choroid. So this is the sclera in green, and in pink we have the choroid. So the ciliary body, there are two layers of the ciliary epithelium. The ciliary epithelium, over the ciliary process, it secretes the aqueous humor. So aqueous humor is the fluid that lies in the aqueous chambers. It is secreted by the ciliary epithelium over the ciliary processes. The non-pigmented ciliary epithelium represents the anterior prolongation of the neural layer of the retina. So the ciliary epithelium, the pigmented ciliary epithelium, it secretes the aqueous humor, and the non-pigmented ciliary epithelium is actually an anterior prolongation of the neural layer of the retina. So this was all about this section, a slightly complex, jumbled up section, but the important thing in this section was the cross-sectional figure that gives an idea of how all the layers come into play with each other. It is important to understand the cross-section so that you can understand the relations and the development of the eye. I hope you liked it. For further sections, keep watching sqadia.com.